I'm Niall Paterson. Welcome to The Daily, where it is time for another in our series of special pre-election reports, Faultlines. And the issue under the spotlight today is farming.
I think there's a lot of farms and farmers that actually feel now that their livelihood and their living and the farm that generations have worked for are genuinely at a point where is it going to be viable for the future?
Now, having grown up close to, if not exactly in the countryside, I've always had something of an interest in how the food I eat gets in my belly. You could see the beef we ate roaming the fields nearby, meat that my family bought at the decidedly unglamorous local farm shop, long before anyone had heard diddly squat about celebrities tilling the land. Fast forward to today, and who isn't familiar with terms like food miles, farm to table, or food security?
Come on then.
Well, quite a lot, it would seem. Farmers are angry. Protests have been held across the country as the agricultural sector evolves in post-Brexit Britain.
Of course, a lot of people say, actually, no, farmers, if they want the taxpayers' subsidies, they've got to look after the environment.
I think they're dead right. The only problem is, what are you going to eat? Berries? Bark?
Cheap foreign imports, changes to subsidies, and a mass of farmers leaving the sector have combined to make this a real issue come the election, even if many of us haven't yet realised. Our reporter behind the latest in our Faultlines series is our West of England and Wales correspondent, Dan Whitehead. Dan, look, I understand that farming is not the industry that it once was, but what has surprised me from your reporting is the anger, the level of anger. And you've been speaking to plenty of people. Just reflect on that.
Yeah, we've spent the last couple of months, Neil, travelling both Wales and England, speaking to a real range of farmers, less wealthy, much smaller upland farmers in Snowdonia, right through to multi-million-pound fruit farming operations down in Kent. And, what's really clear, speaking to all farmers, is you're right, there is a tangible level of anger. What is complicated when you try to explain why farmers are angry to people is that the laws affect different farmers all in different ways. But a lot of these issues stem post-Brexit, and they're now really starting to bite and take effect.
And this is something that, again, absolutely fascinates and indeed surprises me. I suspect many people listening to this podcast will have thought that subsidies for British farmers went the way of our relationship with the European Union post-Brexit. But that's not the case. They are still receiving subsidies, but these are subsidies that come with conditions these days.
Yeah, they always did have conditions. So basically, it was known as CAP, the Common Agricultural Policy, when we were still in the EU. That went away post-Brexit, and now it's a devolved issue. So the governments across the United Kingdom are developing their own agricultural laws and rules over how subsidies work. Subsidies were brought in after World War II to basically guarantee food security. And they've always been around in some form of the other. So in Wales, they're consulting on plans due to come in next year, 2025. One of the big problems that farmers face is that if they want that cash from the government, they need to set aside 10% of their eligible land for tree cover and 10% for natural habitats. So in a worst case scenario, you have a farmer who might have a very small farm and a small amount of eligible land who is faced with losing potentially 20% of it for natural habitat and trees. That, they say, may make their farm financially unviable and actually increase their carbon footprint. And we've been chatting to a farmer in North Wales, Rodri, up in Bala in Snowdonia, and that's very much his case.
Obviously, you'd either have to keep less stock, which makes you less effective, or it then means buying in a lot more winter fodder, because I wouldn't be able to produce enough hay and silage over the summer to carry me through the winter. So then that means more off-farm costs and, making my carbon footprint worse, because it means, buying feeds and carrying it in and hauling it in from other areas.
But I suppose if you were going to encourage a sector to be more environmentally friendly, I mean, isn't agriculture a pretty decent place to start?
Yeah, I mean, let's not beat around the bush. Agriculture across the UK is a big polluter. It accounts for around 10% of the UK's greenhouse gas emissions. So something has to be done. And I haven't spoken to a farmer who disagrees with that. I mean, they will say, look, they have been custodians of the land, whether it's in Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland or England for many thousands of years, and they do look after the land. But of course, in this modern era of farming, you've got chemical usage, and you need to address that. The problem that farmers will say is it's all very well forcing me to increase the amount of trees I have on my farm in order to get that subsidies. The Welsh farmer we spoke to, Rodri, up in Bala in Snowdonia, subsidies make up 40% of his income. So they're absolutely vital to his survival.
This has been the first time I've actually had sleepless nights thinking, am I going to be still here in a few years? And that's not an easy thing to think about when you've been part of this for 4 or 5 generations, to think that you might be the one that fails.
But he will say, it's all very well planting trees, but at the same time, go into your supermarket and you will find a chicken breast for sale for £1 that's come all the way from Brazil. It doesn't tally up according to these farmers, because on one hand, we're increasing our inputs. You will find meat from all over the world in our supermarkets, which could be homegrown. I mean, if you look at what we eat in the UK, about 54% of it is homegrown. Either dairy, meat, grains, we make it ourselves. It's about 54%. 28% comes from the EU and the rest from around the world. We've had imports from the EU for decades. It's not necessarily a Brexit issue. What farmers are worried about is post-Brexit, as new trade deals are signed by the government, like the one with Australia and New Zealand, that will, in their mind and their concern, is it will increase unfairness, it will increase imports, and that will make it even harder for farmers to produce British food. The fact is that if you're getting chicken from Brazil, there is a question as to whether or not the standards are the same as the very high standards that British farmers have to produce to. So it's a long-term concern, but they feel that post-Brexit, as that widens out, as more is imported from abroad, eventually that will suppress British farmers. We are seeing the number of British farmers fall. It's fallen around 13,000 in the last 10 years or so to its lowest level. And more farms will go out of business. I haven't found a farmer over the last couple of months who doesn't know another farmer who's simply gone out of business, saying it's not financially viable with these imports going in, with the supermarkets putting pressure on costs, and of course rising costs that we're all facing as well.
My worst fear is when I look at my friends, their children are not interested in going into farming. The next generation aren't coming into farming. The average age of a farmer in this country is already 70. There's not anyone going to come into the industry.
And what will that mean?
More reliance on substandard foreign imports.
But do these farmers accept the fact that we are in a cost of living crisis, and that ultimately, whilst plenty of people will be concerned about where their food comes from, we all want to do the best by the environment, we all want to buy local where possible. If a chicken costs £10 and a chicken costs £2, which are people going to buy?
It's a question which is faced by every family in the country. We filmed in our piece with a mum in Gloucester, a mum of 2, who, if you see and hear her, she absolutely strikes a chord with every family. She wants to buy British. She says actually her care for the farmers, she does care about them, but it's kind of over there. At the end of the day, she cares about feeding her kids what she wants. And we happened to join her on a supermarket shop. We didn't tell her what to buy, just buy what you buy for your kids. She bought some frozen sausages and they were made from non-EU pork in non-EU beef casings, and it was a fraction of the cost. If you want to go to your butcher to buy some nice sausages or a nice steak that have come from a farm within 10 miles, and it's an absolute luxury choice, isn't it? If you go to a major supermarket, perhaps one of the lower-end, cheaper supermarkets, you can get that produce for an absolute fraction of the price. People vote with their wallets, and in that cost of living crisis, families have got a choice to make. The concern for British farmers is that if they want to make the British choice, it's actually just going to cost too much for many people.
Well, let's move away from the supermarkets and back to the farms. Dan, I've got to say, I really hope you've been picking up free samples from each one that you've been visiting along the way, particularly that strawberry farm that you visited. Now, there, the concerns were, of course, about cost and competitiveness, but also about the staff that they have.
Yeah, a really interesting and unique problem they're faced by bigger farmers in the UK. So he provides strawberries and cherries and loads of other fruit to pretty much all of the major supermarkets in the UK. We were walking through his polytunnels of strawberries. He has something like 700 hectares of these polytunnels. It's an amazing setup, multi-million-pound wage bill. Pre-Brexit, he could get his staff from the EU very easily, of course. He hires around 2,000 staff members at the peak harvest season. And when they came from the EU, they could stay for a year, 2 years. There was a much more flexibility, of course, under the freedom of movement and the freedom to work within the EU. That's gone. There's a visa scheme, but his workers now can only come for a maximum of 6 months. By the time he trains them, he houses them on site in caravans, and he gets them up to speed after a few months. They pretty much have to go home.
I don't need people coming for 6 months. By the time a person comes from 6 months, they've just got good enough for me to make them an economically viable worker, and then they have to go home. The visa is only for 6 months. They've basically put a hand behind my back and told me to fight someone with a gun. I'm in inability. I just can't fight. I can't negotiate fairly because the prices of the fruit coming in from abroad is not reflective of the same cost prices we have.
So for him, that very slim margin when you're operating on that level of production is making it even more difficult, even at that level of farming.
Dan, thank you, and we will be back to Dan just a little later. But after the break, I'll be speaking to the founder of the campaign group Save British Farming, so stay where you are. If you asked 100 people where their food came from, no doubt most would say the supermarket, when, with a little reflection, they'd probably realise it's a bit more complicated than that. But what it does show is that we associate the things we eat with where they're bought and how much they cost, rather than where and how they're produced. And that does not bode well for the agricultural sector. Liz Webster is founder of Save British Farming, and she joins us on the Daily. Liz, look, given the title of your organisation, Save British Farming, this might sound like a bit of a daft question, but what sort of state is British farming in right now?
Well, it's pretty dire, actually. I remember before Brexit saying, if all of these things happened, if there's a war, climate change, blah, 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 then Brexit means we'll be less resilient to be able to deal with these things. And all of the worst things have happened. A war in Europe, Gaza, the climate has been, the worst that we can ever remember. This summer on this farm, we're not going to have a harvest for the first time ever. And we're not alone in that reality. I mean, it's very dystopian to see the fields like this. If you look around everywhere when you're driving around, you'll see that the fields look unloved, unkempt. And they are, because nobody's been able to do what we normally do.
So who do you then point the finger of blame at? I mean, clearly politicians have had a role in this. We have to consider the retailers perhaps as part of a problem. Supermarkets not paying what they could, but paying the minimum that they can for the goods that you and your colleagues produce, but also the public.
Again, I don't like to blame people. The truth is, and we predicted this with Brexit, we knew that as economic pressures were put on consumers, that would mean that they would be more likely to go for the cheaper imports, which puts us at a disadvantage because we can't produce food as cheaply as countries on the other side of the world. Because of our weather and lots of different factors. The blame really is on a heavily populated urban society, I think, and also I would say the political system being first past the post, and that the rural areas are large, by geographical area, but representation in Westminster has been poor. I think from the supermarket's point of view, I see them as lions in Longleat. If the owners of Longleat allowed the lions to go and roam everywhere, they're going to eat everything.
I mean, looking at the politics right now, and of course you'll be keenly aware of the fact, as everyone is right now, that we are on the cusp of another general election. Do you see anything in what the Labour Party is offering, or even discussing right now, that makes you think that your lot might be better with a change of government?
Yes. We're facing unprecedented challenges with food in the next year to 2 years, even in the state it's in now, and that's without anything bad happening. So they really need to get to grips with A, ramping up food production here, but B, we need to free up the trade with our nearest market, because gravity matters, particularly for goods, fresh goods. And the Brexit trade barriers are only actually adding to our misery of food shortages and food inflation.
Farmers in the main did vote for Brexit, did vote to leave the European Union of Farmers.
That's the myth. But farmers voted pretty much in line with the rest of the country. In fact, if anything, it's probably a bit lower given that most are men and most are older, because men voted by 55% for Brexit. But largely it's a myth that farmers all voted for Brexit, but it's something that is in people's minds.
I am very happy I'm very happy to be corrected by the founder of Save British Farming on exactly that point. I mean, 2 words at the heart of this: food security. I mean, does the British public understand the concept of food security? And why are our politicians not talking about it more? We hear it enough when it comes to energy, don't we?
I don't think politicians understand food security. I think they just think the supermarkets have been so efficient that they will be able to cope with it.
I mean, Liz, as you mentioned, this is the first year, I think you said, that you're not going to be bringing in that harvest. But do you have any reason to be optimistic about the future of British farming and very specifically the future of your own farm?
I have to have hope, but also what we want is we want the public to get behind us. Instead of thinking, oh, not another tractor, these farmers, what are they doing? We are working for you. We're providing the food for you that you rely on, and which is about, public health as well. Because if we don't produce your food, you're going to be eating stuff which is mass processed from the other side of the world. And only the rich will be able to afford the nutritious, healthy, tasty British food. And that is not a situation that I'm comfortable with, or any of the farmers that I know. We believe in food equality. And that's why I think the values within the Labour Party are best placed to serve us all. And I really hope that in a year's time, I'm talking to you and I'm saying I was right to be optimistic, because I don't want to continue feeling depressed about it. And we only have to look at what's happened in Sri Lanka to see what goes wrong if there's not enough food. 2 years ago, they had terrible riots. A country that's never had food shortages in its history went through a similar thing to Brexit, making bad decisions which collapsed their food system. And we need to avoid that at all costs.
Well, Liz, we'll have you back on the podcast in a year and we'll find out, won't we? Liz Webster, founder of Save British Farming. Well, let's finish with Dan Whitehead once again. I mean, Dan, is there any reason for optimism in the domestic agriculture sector? I mean, the reason I ask, your reporting, I think, suggested as many as 13,000 farmers have left agriculture recently. The total number of farmers is at its lowest in a decade. I mean, I'm looking around and there seems to be precious little reason for optimism. So please tell me I'm wrong.
There's a general feeling amongst farmers that the government think, well, hold on a minute, the public generally en masse maybe don't care that much. Okay, niche people who go to the butchers and buy that luxury choice, well, they can still do that. So farming can be squeezed and it can be a luxury choice. But actually, there's no real reason to panic about this too much. Another real starting factor as to why the government actually might not care too much is that 70% of the UK's land is taken up by farming, 70%. It contributes around 0.5% to GDP. The government may well be thinking, well, hold on a minute, what do we do with that land? Is farming that important?
What about the body politic, the voters themselves then, Dan? This is, of course, part of our Faultlines series. We are in an election cycle. Why should the British public be mindful of the concerns of these farmers when, as already mentioned, for some of them, buying British is a luxury choice and, cost is king for most people right now?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's the bottom line, isn't it? And that is what people will really ultimately care about. You'll struggle to find a member of the public who doesn't love farming and support that image. It's the iconic image of the United Kingdom, is it? The green rolling hills. What farmers will say is why you should care, why it's a voting issue, is it's not just about buying an expensive steak or an expensive pack of sausages, in your butchers or wherever. Farmers do a lot in their communities. And I think the figure is something like for every farming job, it supports 9 others. If farming in small communities supports local shops, it supports pubs, it employs people, and that is an infrastructure not just in one little pocket. There are, go outside of the M25 and there's pretty much the majority of the country you're never going to be far away from a farm, and those rolling hills are what makes this country. So the farmers will say, look, it is a voting issue. It is in decline. Production is heading for record lows. And actually, if you want to see the farm, and if you lose the farmers, if we continue to lose the farmers and not enforce the political parties to come up with policies to ensure their security, then actually it will have a far bigger impact than whether or not your state comes from the European Union or whether it comes from down the road, because it will impact all communities and the infrastructure of not just countryside life, but life right across the UK.
Dan, many thanks. Now, it may not be the issue that defines the next election, but the future of farming is something of which we all need to be more mindful. So too, how the food we eat reaches our tables and where it was produced. Far from being food secure, if we ignore the agricultural sector's plight, then some, perhaps much of it, could be lost forever. Never has the phrase, you reap what you sow, been more appropriate. That's your lot for this edition of The Daily. We'll see you again soon.